Chapter 12, A Fugitive is Captured, page 100. So, obviously these chapters are not numbered. I might have said this last week. I don't even know. But I took a little pencil, if you're allowed to write in your book, and I numbered. Can you even see that? Well, anyways, I numbered the chapters so that I could know where to go. Sometimes the chapters aren't numbered. Okay, A Fugitive is Captured. Chapter 12, page 100. Bert ventured a few feet down the path, but then raced back to Laura and pulled her into the cellar. There's something out there in a boat, he cautioned. They can't see us with all those bushes, Laura pointed out. I suppose you're right, Bert conceded. But I'll be in trouble with Pa and Joel if the slave catchers find out about this place because of me. Pa never told me where he took the runaways. Guess he didn't think I could keep still about it. I think Pa wanted to keep you safe. It's a dangerous business, you know. Anyway, she consoled him. Joel must have trusted you, or he wouldn't have sent that note. Bert's face brightened. But he said only he was desperate. Laura crossed the narrow cellar, crouched beside the pool, and scooped up a handful of water. It was clear and cold. She tasted it and found it good. A slave could stay here a long time, she remarked. Do you suppose Amos Tryon built these cellars on purpose to hide the fugitives? Bert shook the ladder, testing its strength. Course not. Probably because he planned to use this cellar for his spring house. Butter and milk would keep well in that cold water. Laura began to see the possibilities of the riverbank cellars. One could be a laundry room that could pipe the water up from this spring, and another could be a wine cellar. She gazed around the room where they stood. I guess if these cellars had been planned for the slaves, there'd be some secret hiding places down here. I don't see any place where a slave could get out of sight if the slave catchers came around. Bert agreed. It was too easy for us to find our way through the cellars, he sighed. I guess no place is perfect. At least this is hidden from the road, and it's on the river. Laura stepped outside again and gazed up the steep banks on either side of the house. The cellars certainly are the best way to reach the river. A person could climb down the bank, but it would be dangerous. Bert started up the ladder. Let's go home. Martin will be worried. When they emerged from the house, the sun was still bright, though it was low in the sky. Bert paused only to blow out the lantern before they took the path through the woods. I wish you didn't have to come back tonight, Laura worried. I know I'd hate to come through here in the dark. Maybe Joel will come. I won't have to take Martin. You'd be disappointed if you couldn't go, she challenged him. Maybe I would at that. I think you and Joel and Pa aren't in this Underground Railroad just because of the slaves. It's an adventure. Bert glanced back at her over his shoulder. You wouldn't understand. Pa says a man's conscience is stronger than the law, and he says laws can be bad, like the fugitive slave law. Do you know that law says a slave catcher can swear any black he finds is the fugitive he's looking for, and the black hasn't any right to speak for himself? He pushed on down the lane, muttering, That old Henry Clay, he's to blame for getting the law passed. Laura thought of pointing out that Henry Clay wasn't the only person to blame, but rather than get into an argument, she changed the subject. I suppose Martin couldn't find this place alone. Of course he couldn't. In the dark, and it wouldn't be safe for him to be wandering around. The minute anyone saw him, they'd know who he was. Sally whinnied her pleasure at seeing Laura and Bert again. Laura ran ahead to see if anyone was on the road, while Bert backed the carriage down the narrow lane. The leaves rustled under her feet, making, she felt, too much noise. And what would anyone think, seeing her burst forth from the woods with her hair flying and her bonnet hanging down her back? Slowing her pace, she slipped into the denser shadow of a pine tree. Here she stood motionless, listening for the sound of hoofs or wagon wheels on the river road. All she heard was the creak and rustle of her own carriage on the lane and Sally's snort of protest at being forced to back so far. Encouraged, she peered around the tree and finally emerged boldly onto the edge of the road. No one was in sight. She ran back to Bert. "Hurry, the road's clear." Remembering how he had removed their tracks on the way to Tyrant's Folly, she snatched up a branch, and as soon as the carriage was again on the road, she whisked out the tracks at the entrance to the lane. "Jump in," Bert urged. No telling when someone will come along. They had been underway only a minute or two, and were approaching Judge Stowe's house when a horse and rider pounded toward them. "That was close," murmured Bert. The rider slowed his horse and shouted at them, "They caught a slave in Lewiston. I'm rounding up help to set him free." "Good," shouted Bert. When the rider had gone on, Laura asked fearfully, "Do you think it's Martin?" Bert slapped his reins. "Giddy up," he shouted. "How do I know? He should have been safe enough provided he stayed where we left him. We've been gone a long time. Maybe he decided we'd deserted him. Or maybe the slave catchers broke into the house and found him." Bert agreed with maddening calm. "It may be," was all he said. Laura stared anxiously ahead. Perhaps at this very moment, Walt was taking Martin back to the master who had beaten him. "Can't that horse go any faster?" "Of course she can. She's the fastest horse for miles around. But if we go racing down the road, someone's going to wonder why we're in such a hurry and maybe follow us home." "Oh, all right." Laura sat back on the seat and yanked her bonnet into place on her head. "Are you going to try to set the runaway free, whoever he is?" She was so sure Bert would say yes, she wondered why she even asked. But, to her amazement, he shook his head. "Pa says we shouldn't draw notice to ourselves, and we can do more good work working in secret." On Center Street, the press of people became thick in spite of the wideness of the road. Bert jumped down from the carriage and, flinging the reins to Laura, called out, "Wait here." From her vantage point on the carriage seat, Laura could see her brother pushing his way through the crowd that poured up the street to the east. Laura called out to a woman passerby, "Where's everyone going?" "To the Presbyterian church. They cornered a runaway slave there." The church was on Cayuga Street, not far from Joel's house. Laura pulled Sally to the side of the road in front of Mr. Josiah Tryon's tailor shop. Through the window she could see Mr. Tryon working as if nothing were going on outside. The dark, bearded man who had been with him before was still there, standing near the window. If Mr. Tryon was a leader of the Underground Railroad, would he sit inside there with his back to the window? Yes, maybe he would. Just as Bert said, he wouldn't want to be noticed as a sympathizer. Near the trailer shop, a narrow road called Niagara Street led south toward Cayuga. It was a small street, little more than an alleyway. The crowd was ignoring this shortcut. Only a few people broke away from the rest and ran down it. Laura hesitated only a moment. Bert had said to wait, but she had just as much right as he to find out if the captured fugitive was Martin. She stepped down from the carriage and tied Sally to a hitching post. Then, with her skirt lifted above her ankles, she fled down Niagara Street. She ran until she was out of breath. Then she walked as rapidly as she could past Plain Street on toward Cayuga Street. When she slowed down to catch her breath, she caught snatches of conversation from the others who hurried toward the church. "We ought to lynch them. Show those Southerners We know how to do it, too. Laura looked in amazement at the speaker, a gentle-faced man with white hair hanging over his ears in a fringe. Those slave catchers have no business coming up north, the white-bearded man declared. Ought to give them a taste of their own medicine. Hearing this, Laura realized he was in favor of lynching the slave catchers, not the captured slave. She set her lips firmly together. What should a person think in these days? One thing she was sure of, lynching was wrong no matter who the victim was. Who do y'all think it is that they caught? Find out in the next chapter.